I'd now like to introduce Patrick Deasey, who's co-chair of AABR's Glyphosate Working Group. Now, Patrick will chair the talks and any discussion arising from them, and he'll also introduce the other speakers. Now, a little bit about Patrick. He's co-founder and director of NatureLinks Landscape Management Proprietary Limited. NatureLinks carries out biodiversity management works in the Greater Melbourne area for many local councils and semi-government authorities. Pat has a degree in horticulture and a master's in agribusiness and has been working in environmental restoration for the past 25 years. So look, he has a special interest in weed control techniques of all types. So I'd like to hand over now to Patrick. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Tein. Welcome, everybody. Yes, it is obviously a very hot topic at the moment, glyphosate, and especially amongst those of us who have come to depend on it over, well, the last 30 years at least. It's been around, and we've come to know it as a relatively safe and relatively environmentally friendly chemical and tool to use in managing weed incursions and preserving biodiversity. And biodiversity management does face unique challenges due to the perennially limited budgets that we seem to have, and a seeming lack of competitive chemicals and strategies that we might use to assist us in maintaining our efforts to continue with biodiversity management and those outcomes. So AABR is a very useful conduit for information between users in the field, decision makers and the public, and that's why the Glyphosate Working Group came about, which is aiming to assist on this by considering all the issues that are out there amongst glyphosate and try and draw those in and collate them, because there's a lot out there and it's very hard to wade through, and distill those, what those consequences and what some of the opportunities are around that, and then feed those back in a form that our members and the public might be able to find when they're looking for non-biased, scientifically based information. So just to stop all of us having to reinvent the wheel and do the research ourselves. So yeah, so later I'll talk a bit about the website and the links that you might be able to use. So we're lucky to have Tim Lowe talking to us today. He's our first guest speaker. Tim Lowe is a biologist, prize-winning author of 7 books, including Feral Future, which is probably the one that jumps to mind for most of us when we hear of Tim's name, which is about invasive species. And that helped the inspiration for Tim and others starting the Invasive Species Council, which is an NGO that works for creating better policies on managing invasive species. And the Invasive Species Council engaged Tim to write a report about glyphosate. And Tim's put together a great summary on the credible research around the safety about glyphosate in an easy to read article, but it still provides a balanced view and information that will be useful to the public and people who are decision makers who are trying to wade their way through the morass of articles and opinions that are out there. So hopefully Tim will provide some background to his research and maybe some of how he sees we should frame our arguments around the responsible use of glyphosate. So Tim, if you could take us through what you've learnt and the article you've written. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, no, this report was done out of concern that a lot of the media reporting on glyphosate just seemed to be over the top. And so the purpose of the report was not to say glyphosate is good or glyphosate is safe, but to go through a lot of the statements being made about it and try and try and provide some clarity, because there's a lot of complex issues that are not coming across in the articles you read about it in the media. And so an example of what I would think of as poor reporting. So here's that quote at the top from a British Guardian article saying that traces of glyphosate are found in our food and even our body fluids. This is one example of human health environmental woes that Monsanto is causing. Now, if you look at the second quote, which appears in my report, I found the US President's Cancer Panel. This is a panel that Trump got rid of and hopefully will be reinstated by Biden. It notes that traces of nearly 300 different chemicals have been found in the bodies of babies. And what that's really saying is we live in a chemical world. The modern world is swimming in chemicals, plastics, all sorts of artificial chemicals that we've created. And the comment that glyphosate is in our body, well, so are another 300 chemicals. And so I think people don't realize the extent to which we have created a world of chemicals, and that just saying there's glyphosate in our bodies, that's neither here nor there. That's just, as I say, there are hundreds of these chemicals. And so I was wanting to write the report to go past that kind of shallow journalism and say that, look, that's not telling us anything useful. So, as I say, the report, it wasn't about defending glyphosate. And if you look at that quote on where I've got the arrow, I actually, because of my little voice box, I can't see it. It's obscured by my own face. But I know it says something along the lines of glyphosate may well be a carcinogen. So I'm not saying it doesn't cause cancer. It's not about condoning it, but I'm saying, current research suggests that it won't cause cancer if you use it according to instructions. So this is a very moderated comment, and I'll explain why. The report should say that there are papers suggesting that maybe it does cause cancer. There are other papers suggesting it doesn't. It's hard to work through them. If you look at the blue boxes that are provided there, I wanted to be totally scrupulous with the evidence, not kind of write a pro-glyphosate report. And if I had read enough evidence to convince me that glyphosate was really as dangerous as some people are saying, I just would have not written the report. It would have been unethical for me to do it, and it wouldn't have suited the Invasive Species Council to do so. But if you look at that right-hand quote, there's actually a cancer epidemiologist saying that local councils should try to stop using it. Now, I don't actually agree with that quote, but I put it in the report in the interest of trying to be just completely open about the evidence that's out there. Now, one of the issues that I think was poorly understood is the difference between a hazard assessment versus a risk assessment. So what made glyphosate really controversial in recent years, it was controversial before because of the connection with genetically modified foods, but the recent controversy goes back to the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, saying it's probably a carcinogen. And so a lot of people thought, well, once they come out with that finding, then the Australian government, all governments around the world, should then just automatically ban glyphosate. And there's a really deep misunderstanding there about the kind of assessments that were done. So IARC's assessment was a hazard assessment. So all they were doing was asking the question, is glyphosate capable of causing cancer, yes or no? Whereas an agency like the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, which decides about pesticides legality in Australia, their question is, if you use it according to instructions, will you get cancer or other harms? And so these are quite different questions. Of course, if you drink glyphosate, it's going to be very harmful, but no one's going to be drinking glyphosate. So hazard, risk, they're very different things. Now, in trying to, this is the hardest part of the report for me, is in trying to understand the research, because you could say that part of the misunderstanding is over the difference between a hazard versus a risk assessment, but that's not why there are differences of opinion about glyphosate. You have got some experts saying we should move against glyphosate and others not, and they're using, they're giving different amounts of weighting to different amounts of research. What I find most interesting is that everyone agrees that there is one study that stands head and shoulders above all others. This is the American Agricultural Health Study. And what made this really valuable is what's called a cohort study, where they took a very large number of farmers and other people who are exposed to chemicals, not looking for people who had cancer, but just getting people at random who'd agree to be part of the survey, and then monitoring them year after year after year to check on their exposure to all possible harmful chemicals and other environmental products out in the environment, and then monitoring those who caught cancer. Now, the interesting thing about this study is that it doesn't find any evidence that glyphosate is causing cancer in that study. And what is also interesting is that IARC, the body that says that glyphosate is probably a carcinogen, they agree that this is the best study there is, and they accept that it hasn't found any evidence of cancer. But there are hundreds of these other much smaller studies, and some of these have indicated that maybe it does. And so it's possible for the APVMA to criticise these smaller studies. And there's a lot of criticisms about small studies, where the sample size is quite small, that you can just pick a certain sample that shows an effect that, is not more widespread in the community. But a particular issue is what's called recall bias, so you get a group of people who have got cancer, and in case of glyphosate, it's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And you say, well, how much exposure did you have to glyphosate in your life? And these people sit awake at night, they've got cancer, they've got plenty of time to think. And their sense of how much exposure they had to glyphosate during their life is very strong. They remember all these times they used it, and these loom large in their minds. Whereas the other people you will test them against in your study will be people who don't have cancer, but who otherwise are fairly similar to them in their lifestyle. And these people, they're not lying awake at night wondering about how much glyphosate they use. And if you go to them and say, well, how much glyphosate have you used over the years? They are likely to give much lower estimates than the people who've got cancer, even if the amounts used were the same. So there are accepted problems with these studies, but it's not a reason to throw them out altogether. And some of these indicate that maybe you do get cancer from glyphosate. Now, a particularly important part of the report, certainly from my point of view, is that it's just, people think that, okay, if something maybe can cause cancer, you just ban it straight out. But I don't think people really think about how many substances there are in our environment that are either may probably cause cancer, which is the rating that IARC gave to glyphosate, or which definitely cause it. And of course, I think we all know that alcohol definitely causes cancer, sunshine, but like salami, leather dust. I think that people will fear the prospect of cancer from glyphosate more than they will fear getting it from spicy foods or hot frying or salted fish, all these things which are considered to be carcinogens. Is that in our minds, we identify glyphosate as a poison. It's used to kill plants. Now, in actual fact, that kills plants by attacking an enzyme pathway that's not found in people or other animals. So it can't actually harm us in the same way that it harms plants. But I think because we think, oh yes, glyphosate is a poison, then people psychologically rate it more highly than all these other carcinogens. But I think, putting it in these tables in a proper setting, you could see that the IARC rating, it's not a big deal. Well, I shouldn't say it's not a big deal, but if you're going to stop drinking alcohol, not go out in the sunshine, not eat salami, you'd have to do all of those things if you're saying that you're not willing to take risks with cancer. Another, I think, really important issue is the concept of regrettable substitutions. Now, glyphosate is seen by the farming community today as a much safer alternative to DDT, dieldrin, these other chemicals that we used in the old days. And there is this problem where a new chemical comes on the market, there's not a lot known about it, research builds up, and then inevitably some of that research doesn't look so good and people start saying we should ban it. Now, if you look at the alternative chemicals that are being used to glyphosate, it's amazing how little research there is on most of them. And some of them, IARC has not assessed whether they're carcinogenic, just simply saying we do not have enough research to go on. because IARC doesn't do research itself, it just assesses existing research. And so because glyphosate is so, it's the world's #1 herbicide, if you go into a Web of Science search engine on research papers on glyphosate, there's bloody hundreds of the damn things, just hundreds and hundreds of them. Whereas if you put in something like atrazine, it's like, wow, this has hardly been looked at. And so given the reservations there are about cancer studies, with these small sample sizes, I would suspect that most of these chemicals, or probably all of these chemicals, if you did as many research studies on them as have been done on glyphosate, they would come out looking worse, or they'd come out looking as bad. And that certainly, personally, if I had the choice between all these chemicals, I would go with glyphosate, because it's the one where I can see that there's a heck of a lot known about it, and that all these alternatives, there is just not that much known. And then when you come to the non-chemical alternatives like steam treatments and vinegar, well, as Arbor knows, I mean, these just don't work in terms of bushland weeds. They might kill a little weed in a crack in the pavement, but they're of no use for killing shrubs and vines and invasive grasses. So I was very pleased when the report came out that the Guardian wrote a very good article about it. I think it was great the way Peter Dixon, president of your organisation, was quoted as backup, saying here were clear evidence that people who use glyphosate, who are generally speaking intelligent, environmentally sensitive, were willing to assess the evidence and decide that there has been a lot of media misrepresentation of glyphosate going on. And so I was very pleased with the way that has come out. So there's a note from Peter Dixon that was a misquote. I might leave Peter to comment on that. Okay, so the report is on our website, and I've seen occasional situations where there's been some sort of media comment where I've thought someone has heard about my report, but they clearly haven't read it, and they've made some comment about glyphosate that doesn't seem to in any way reflect the content of the report. So I really would say to everyone, read it. I put a huge amount of effort into trying to make it easy to read, and it was a heck of a hard thing to write. But there it is, and I encourage everyone to have a look. Thank you. That's my talk.
Thank you, Tim. That was excellent. So I really encourage anyone who hasn't read the article to read it. It's very comprehensive. It's very balanced. As Tim says, he's not there waving the flag for glyphosate. He's just evaluating the research around it, and it is a very widely researched chemical. So it's if you want to find it, then there's a link on our website. But if you just Google Tim Lowe glyphosate, you'll very quickly find it on the Invasive Species Council website. Andy Erskine is our next speaker. Andy Erskine's a horticulturist and a bush regenerator with many years experience, and in his position as the technical officer for Byron Shire Council, he was very closely involved in the implementation of the council's integrated pest management strategy, which aspires currently to the minimisation of herbicide use in all public areas of Byron Shire. Because Andy's certainly been at the bleeding edge of this, as Byron were one of, if not probably the very first local government areas to restrict the use of pesticides very heavily, including glyphosate. And Andy had to cope with initially not having the tools that they would have had originally to do their work, not just in bushland management, in keeping sightline clear along roads and all the stuff that we know that glyphosate has been used for over the years in local government. So they've been forced to innovate, educate, use alternative means, and his talk will provide some salutary and also some inspirational examples of what they were able to use. So thanks, Andy. If you could let us know your experiences.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm glad to be here today. Yeah, it certainly has been a trip. Byron Shire, for those of you who are familiar with it, is a very beautiful and diverse place. We have subtropical subtropical climate, very good soils, which are a legacy of our volcanic background. Second highest level of diversity in Australia after the wet tropics, and a fairly large and rugged terrain within our shire. Very high environmental values and lots of threatened in ecological communities. Our population is only about 43,000 at the moment, but we have 2.4 million visitors per year, which is quite hard on infrastructure. Every one of those people at some stage probably stand in Apex Park opposite the top pub in Byron Bay, and I can tell you it's quite an effort to keep that turf growing. We have a green council. Sorry, I'm just trying to roll my screen. Yeah, a deep green council, I should probably say, for the last few terms of council, there've been a green majority, and it would be seen as quite a political coup if one of those councils were able to ban the use of herbicides. The practicalities of that, though, are, very difficult to achieve. So they actually resolved some years ago to cease the use of all chemical pesticide, which left the staff a little bit aghast at the prospect of that. But we had to rally and try to come up with some practical solutions. When that resolution was actually announced, there was a lot of cheering from amongst the residents and those that live in Byron Bay, and they thought that that it was instant, that all chemicals had been banned. So any of our operators that were working on the sides of the roads with spray packs and so on, they're having a really hard time. People were driving by in their cars and actually hanging out and yelling abuse at them, saying, "Don't you know that that's banned? You're poisoning the country." And any spray marks around around road markers and things like that, suddenly we're getting complaints from the public direct to the mayor in a lot of cases, where the managers of that particular department would have to explain the use of the herbicide. So people became very confused about it all, particularly staff, and they said it's just much easier if we don't use herbicide. So our roadsides probably suffered a bit, where in the past the guardrails and sight posts and so on started getting buried in long grass, and we didn't really have solutions. If we tried to put staff out there to manage those grasses and weeds manually, we were putting them at risk from speeding vehicles, particularly rural roadsides and roundabouts and so on. There was a lot at stake. As I said before, very high biosecurity, very high biodiversity levels that we feel responsible for. Lots of threatened species, biosecurity, amongst which is bidoo bush, where we actually are in a containment zone for bidoo bush at the moment. And if we allow bidoo to go uncontrolled, the council can actually be fined by the Weeds Authority. The aesthetic values, particularly things like lantana and buddleia, just could quickly dominate a lot of our roadside vistas and have a deep effect on particularly remnant vegetation. Public safety, that's a lot to do with the ability to see the road clearly. When those weeds grow, they also have an effect on the roads as far as they could physically crack roadsides, but they can stop water running off the roads and create a lot more puddling, block drainage and so on. So what we did, we had to actually determine to what extent herbicides were being used throughout all of our departments. So I work for open space, which is basically parks and gardens. And because I'm close to the cutting edge of that, it was pretty easy to access all of my records, but I had to know what the roads guys were doing and what the people working in the utilities department were doing, and those that did building maintenance. We had to work out like what constitutes a high use public area as per the resolution. So we had all these, we had almost ceased altogether the use of herbicides, but then we had to say, all right, what is a public area? And we tried to define that by levels of use and where people are likely to come into actual physical contact with a herbicide that had been sprayed. So things like high use parks, bus stops, outside shops and so on, where people might have lunch. That's what we thought. Okay, they're high use public areas. We may be able to come up with alternatives to glyphosate in those areas. So we looked at the alternatives. We had an operator contracting locally with a steam weeder. This was a very popular tool, particularly with our councillors, where they could say, look, this is an alternative to herbicide and we're doing it. So that would go around. But as Tim said before, it had very limited use in the bushland situation. You couldn't use it to inject a tree. You can't use it to selectively manage weeds in turf grass. It's quite cumbersome and noisy, makes a lot of fumes and things. So it's almost like a political tool. Council actually owns one, and it's used pretty much 5 days a week. So it gets around the Shire, mainly in the urban areas and town centres, and it's treating weeds in pavement. And we also use it to sort of steam clean some of our park furniture and things. So it's got its purpose, but it would be very difficult to use on the scale necessary to really manage weeds to the level that we're responsible for. So with when we brought the different staff together and began to understand their needs for weed control, we were able to outline the integrated pest management strategy. And we were very fortunate that we were able to bring in some consultants for that. We had a fairly generous budget to develop that and had some staff that could dedicate their time to it. And it was quite a process. It went through public consultation, a lot of meetings with councillors, and eventually came to something that we could work with. So once we had actually defined those public areas and got agreement from councillors that yes, these are high use public areas, that some of those other areas are perhaps too difficult or dangerous to work with the alternative methods available, we found we were gathering some sort of standing on what we could do. What became apparent too is that the use of herbicide by staff in the past hadn't been overly questioned, and it was probably a bit of a hangover from times gone by when people could just drive around and hang out windows and spray guideposts and so on. So we thought, all right, while we have all this great soils and rainfall, and it's obviously a place where not only native plants but weeds can proliferate, what can we do to better control them? And that was obviously in improving our cultural practices. So just different things like for turf, for example, like where we were, very high usage, like that 2.4 million people I mentioned before, stomping around and having markets and so on lawn areas. That's a real perfect conditions to breed weeds, bindii and so on, just thrive on compaction. So if we can improve our cultural practices, which might be a bit of an investment, but through aeration, fertilizing those lawns, then we find that the turf grows more strongly and will actually make the conditions less perfect for weeds. So irrigation was introduced into some of the sports fields and high use public areas, and as well as those turf maintenance regimes. Out on the roadsides, the rural roadsides, one of our biggest problems was Soteria growing, which is a grass that grows to a considerable height and actually can obscure those arco rails and so on. So it was pretty obvious as we were mowing some of those areas, we were spreading seed around. So we worked with the slasher operators and introduced programs where we were trying to mow those areas prior to seed set. Machine hygiene is still a goal. It's a little hard to achieve, to actually wash down machinery when you're way out in the hills somewhere. You've got to consider what happens to the material that's been washed off the machine. So we haven't quite been able to achieve that yet, but it's still on our radar. Sometimes the weeds that are present, although they're an exotic species, they may actually be preferable to something else. So an example of that would be melanus. So the red natal grass, where that grows, it appears to have some sort of allelopathic ability. So it forms a thick colony, but while it's a exotic species, it only grows to about knee high. And we actually find that much preferable to Soteria, which would grow to like shoulder height. So that's sort of an observation that we may be able to use to our advantage in the future. On our sports fields, we would never use glyphosate anyway, really, on sports fields. It's just not appropriate because it's non-selective on grasses. But what we do use on sports fields is we try to improve the culture to minimise the weeds in the first place. And then we would use selective herbicides and in some cases pre-emergence to actually prevent those weeds germinating in the first place. And pre-emergence can also be useful on garden beds and so on in town if used carefully prior to mulching. The exclusion zones for herbicide were mapped so that all staff had access to that via our GIS system, and an education program that we undertook with staff. So they knew that there were areas where they just absolutely could not spray. And then a pesticide use decision tree was developed. And this was a particularly useful tool where, it made every staff member responsible for actually really considering what the implications of using herbicide may be and whether they were authorised to do so. So they had to step through this process and question, do we need it, or is there an alternative? Is the weed tolerable? Is there a physical way or a non-chemical way to, or non-chemical way to deal with it? And then ultimately to get signed off by their manager. So while this sort of initially led to more work, it has had some significant reduction in chemicals. With our bush regenerators, who would probably use the most glyphosate amongst all the staff, we've been able to reduce the amount significantly there as well. It's been mainly through probably reducing the number of sites a little bit and then increasing visitation to those sites. So rather than going to one site, treating it comprehensively and then not going back for 3 or 4 months to find that a lot of it, the grasses and so on, had been grown, we increased the visitation, and we then found that every time we went back that there were less and less weeds. And so some of those now we can get through very quickly and with minimal herbicide. So it's been quite an experience. I've got councils from all over Australia ringing up on a fairly regular basis, and they're saying, oh, we've heard that Byron has banned all herbicides, and our councillors would like to do the same. How do you do it? And I basically give them the same talk as what I've given you today. So if you want to see that integrated pest management strategy, you can go onto Byron Shire Council's website, and you should be able to find it fairly readily just through a general search. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andy. That's great just to see the real world challenges that you've had, and that and how it went from being completely glyphosate free to winding back so that sensible uses is there. That pesticide tree looked quite complicated, but it actually looked like, when you look at it carefully, it looked quite useful. So I'm sure some other people will be looking at a similar sort of decision making process. They're the two key speakers. So we did ask for people to submit questions prior to the talk, and a few of those have come through. And as Tein mentioned earlier, we've aggregated those into similar responses or similar questions. So sorry if your exact question didn't get answered, but we tried to ask ones that were, tried to formulate them into a similar one. So one was, the first question was about how are current bans working, and it brought up an interesting question, because I don't really know exactly how many councils do have bans on them, and I think we were just talking before that this would be a good survey to do and see which councils around Australia have actually got bans. From what I can see, there's at least half a dozen Australia-wide at the moment, and I could be out by a factor of 10 for all I know, that have implemented bans. And there's quite a few I know of that have got bans in the pipeline. I know that my own council down here in the north of Melbourne has already voted for a ban, and on glyphosate, that is, and we'll be phasing that in over the next few years. And I know the Parks Department, or the people who look after the Indigenous vegetation, are tearing their hair out a bit, because it's going to have some significant effects on their budgets and what they're able to do to effectively manage weeds. Yeah, I think that would be good. We'll try and put together a spreadsheet, which will be on the information page eventually, on the Glyphosate Working Group page, of where they are all up to. But as to effectiveness, how that's going, I can sort of state from first-hand experience and from many colleagues that work in the industry and that are members of AABR as well, that there's certainly challenges with the alternatives. And one of the main challenges relates to the next part of the question, which is safety. And the big problem seems to be that a lot of us are having to turn to chemicals that are higher up the poison schedule, or higher up the hazard tree, so to speak, or certainly more unpleasant to use. Some of the so-called organic alternatives are very pungent. We get complaints from members of the public because of the smell, and often we're now forced to, some practitioners are forced to use 2 separate chemicals, because in a given area you might need to use a broadleaf specific herbicide and then a grass specific herbicide to control the suite of weeds that there are there. So, and some of these, as Tim mentioned, there's very little research on them. So we don't actually know whether they're having untoward effects on the soil biota or any of those other effects. Amenity, I think there's definitely strong feedback that amenity has been affected in some areas, but which might be less of an issue with bush regeneration because, as Andy alluded to, there's lots of different areas, and certainly with councils, of where glyphosate's used. So depending on where the area is, amenity might not be such an issue for us, where we're really about controlling the key threats to an ecosystem or an area with biological significance. So, and that might be a good area for where there is some compromise available in reducing herbicide generally, if people are prepared to have less neat looking areas. But certainly the amenity and the cost go together, because we've had several councils who have mentioned that to try and achieve the same amount of amenity that their residents are used to in some areas, they would require very, very high increases in budgets to try and achieve the same levels with the alternatives out there. I know we did some trials with steam, as Andy mentioned, and it's very, very slow. Some of the other chemicals are not very effective. But yeah, with an integrated weed management approach, we might be able to. It's an opportunity to fine tune the way we do attack some of these weeds, and prioritise them and adopt those best practices, like making sure that weeds are treated before they set seed, and all those other good things that we know about. And I know that one council in Melbourne, Frankston, which we've got a link now on the working group page, I think, or about to, the resources page. Frankston Council had a 2-year ban on glyphosate, and the amenity and the biodiversity values were suffering in some areas, and they voted to overturn that. So they've compromised. It's not going back to how it was before, but they have overturned the ban on the use of glyphosate. So because they were envisaging a cost increase of many hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep the weeds under control. And cost isn't certainly not the only factor. They just weren't able to control the high threat weeds or the amenity weeds that people were demanding that they did. So that's sort of pretty much my response to and my knowledge about that particular question that Victoria posed there. So I'll probably hand over the next question to Andy, which is are the alternatives out there of greater or lesser hazard, and what are the implications for liability and training? So that's a conglomerate of 2 questions there. So Andy, if you got something to, if you could chip in on about that.
Yes, so there are 2 parts of it, as you say. So what immediately comes to mind as an alternative would perhaps be those new herbicides which are claimed to be organic, and amongst those which we've tried, we have had reported some operator discomfort from the high level of vinegar fumes and so on, and perhaps an increased sensitivity where they've gone home complaining of sore throats and sore eyes and so on. So you do have to look at perhaps what you're using. I also would consider the potential effect on soil biota of using vinegar repeatedly, as with steam, any sort of the pelargonic acids and things like that. So I don't know whether they have been well researched. The other side of the question is alternatives to glyphosate. So there are certainly alternatives, things that will kill weeds, but such as 2,4-D and even metsulfurin, methyl, and so on. And like metsulfurin is a great sort of herbicide, and in a lot of applications, it's a really good alternative where glyphosate may be viewed dimly by the public. They seem to have lesser concerns with that. So metsulfurin has very low toxicity to mammals, but if you read the label carefully, you'll find that it has a high toxicity to aquatic life. So that's a consideration, whereas glyphosate is actually registered for use in some aquatic situations. So I think that there are alternatives out there, but they really need weighing up as to what their wider effects may be. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that, Andy. And one that Jenny from Tasmania has posited is that is a bit of a reasonably common concern you hear, is that the regulatory agencies, and in this case, the APVMA, the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medical Association, Medicines Association, are they without bias? Are they in the pay of the chemical companies? That levies from people like Bayer or Monsanto are used to fund the existence of APVMA, so they have an inherent bias, and they're not going to the piper, he who pays the piper plays the tune, so to speak. So this is a pretty common one, and I know it comes up with pharmaceutical products as well. So might just get Tim, if you could speak to that, because you've got a bit of a better understanding on how they're funded and what the role of the APVMA is in Australia.
Yeah, well, I looked into some of the APVMA's judgments over the years. I mean, in 2010, they banned endosulfan. 2014, they banned fenthion. It's used to get rid of parasites on cattle. 1996, they were assessing methazole, and the company that promoted it withdrew it. I assume that was because the evidence wasn't going their way, and so that the APVMA was likely to ban it. So they just pulled it out of contention before that. The APVMA also, they restricted use of dimethoate. This is used on tomatoes and capsicums, and this APVMA restriction immediately stopped exports of tomatoes and capsicums to New Zealand. So there was a quite an instant economic effect on agricultural producers, and so now they use irradiation to get those tomatoes and capsicums to New Zealand because there's no chemical alternative. So, I mean, these examples are not consistent with the idea that the APVMA is captive to chemical companies, because in each case, there's going to be some chemical company that's wants these chemicals to stay on the market. I think one thing that people are confusing is, we're used to the idea that a company might make a donation to a political party in return for favours when it gets into office. But what you really have with these levies is a user pays system. So the idea is that the government is spending money on assessing these chemicals. The assessments they do, if they lead to the approval of the chemical, are going to be of commercial benefit to the companies. Therefore, the companies should pay for the assessments. Now, that is quite different from the political situation where if a political party doesn't do what the company wants, then they're not going to get a donation in the future. In this case, these levies, the companies don't have a choice. I mean, they're just required to pay it, whether they get the outcome they want or not. So I would say that the evidence is showing that the APVMA is not captive to chemical companies. It's interesting at the moment, APVMA is assessing fipronil. I mean, I'm deeply concerned about that because fipronil is what's used to control fire ants around Brisbane and crazy ants in the wet tropics and Christmas Island. I think it'll just be appalling if they abandon that. And I mean, I know I shouldn't be saying this, but I almost wish they were in the beholden to the chemical companies, because I really hope there's no ban put into place on fipronil.
Okay, thanks for that. Yes, no, I know they certainly have had an impact on some of the uses of chemicals as well, not just them being withdrawn. I mean, dimethyl, I think it's Rogor, isn't it? And that used to be sold willy-nilly in nurseries along with carbaryl and things like that, that they certainly now know the APVMA have restricted the use for the general public. So I know they certainly don't have much fear in reducing the use of some of these chemicals. Okay, well, I think we're travelling all right for time, Tein. So there are a couple more questions that we might ask. Andy, not Andy. Peter, there's a question here about how do you get tested for glyphosate? If you're concerned about it, what are the implications of that? What's the mechanism of going and getting tested for glyphosate? Is there any point in going and getting tested for glyphosate residues in your body if you're concerned about that?
Peter might have to unmute.
Oh, I have unmuted. It's my understanding that there are tests, and I was actually looking up this just before the meeting, and a number of companies do offer glyphosate tests, but the question should also be for what purpose? I mean, based on Tim's talk earlier, there's over 300 exotic chemicals, anthropogenic chemicals can be found in newborns, and so it's a matter of what purpose is testing for one particular chemical, especially since there's no definitive threshold levels which can relate to specific risks of any disease. But it's also my understanding that a number of bush regenerators have been tested in the past and found no residues in their body. But a simple Google search will locate a lab in Australia if you are interested.
Okay, thanks. And another hot topic is always around bees. People were concerned about worldwide issues with honeybee collapse disorder, and I don't think that's necessarily such an issue in Australia, but glyphosate is lumped in with other chemicals. I know neonicotinoids get a lot of bad press, yeah. So what the question was that the ISC paper seems to ignore the research on the impact of glyphosate on European honeybees, and what message would you have for beekeepers who are concerned about continued glyphosate use? So, Tim, you've had a look at some of those papers and some of those concerns. Are you able to speak to that briefly, please, Tim?
Yeah, so there is a journal article saying that honeybees exposed to glyphosate can become disoriented. So evidence that it can cause behavioural problems in a period when they're exposed to it. But the issue you raised about the global decline in honeybees, I mean, there's a huge amount of research on that because of the economic significance of it, and it's been very difficult for scientists to work out causality in this. So there are some that are pushing towards the idea that it's particularly varroa mites and viruses that are spreading. So Nosema virus. So the European honeybee is now acquiring pests and pathogens from all these Asian species of honeybee that it's coming into contact with. And so that's a problem. Another factor in global honeybee declines is loss of natural habitat that can help honeybees, and all, like loss of natural nectar sources, and also agricultural insecticides. So they're being affected by some groups of insecticides. But I mean, I looked through a lot of that literature. I couldn't find any mention of anyone suggesting that glyphosate has got anything to do with the global declines of honeybees. Certainly, as you said, in the Australian situation, we've got very healthy honeybees. There's a recent CSIRO report saying we've got some of the world's healthiest honeybees. So there's no reason to think that glyphosate is an issue for those. And it gets back to what I was saying before. There's hundreds of chemicals floating around. There are hundreds of environmental issues, and you can pluck out that one research paper saying that if you spray glyphosate on flowers and then bees visit those flowers, those bees will then be disoriented. But there's no reason to think that that research result has got anything to do with the global plight of honeybees. And you can easily go on Wikipedia. There's a Wikipedia entry on global colony collapse, and I don't think there's any. I don't think glyphosate comes up even once on that web page, for example.
No,
if I could add something very quickly to that.
Yep.
There are some critiques of the research on the two bits of research from which was the disorientation, and secondly was the gut fauna of bees, which I think we might get up on the working group page. But the studies at best were indicative and initial. They weren't comprehensive studies. I think this is an area where we can put in additional information on. I should actually announce that I'm also an apiarist.
Thanks, Andy. So am I. I keep a few hives, and I have, so I'm obviously very careful, especially with chemicals. I tend to be very careful about any insecticides being sprayed near my bees, but so far I've got no cause for concern about glyphosate. Well, I think that's probably it, team, for questions. Thanks very much for that. So we have been capturing some additional questions. I know that a few have come through on the chat, and we'll put some answers to those back up on the AABR website on the Glyphosate Working Group page. And this has been recorded. If your friends weren't able to log on because they're taking the kids to sport or whatever, then it'll be shared and available.
Algo tan simple como glyphosate.
Oh, someone's coming in there. So we'll be able to catch up on this as a recording. So, and so if you do have any additional things that you want to talk about, or contributions or questions, I'd just ask you to, rather than the chat will close obviously at the end of the meeting. So if you could reach out to us via the email address education@aabr.org.au. So that's education@aabr.org.au. So that's a great place to follow this discussion. And it's been a bit hectic up till now, but we're hoping to build the resources on the Glyphosate Working Group links page, and we'll possibly start a forum there for people to talk about this and share their experiences. So this is just the start of it. So thanks very much for that. And I'll say that I'll conclude that part of the meeting, which is the two very good talks by Andy and Tim. And so thanks, guys. And yes, I'll hand over now to Tein to take over the formal part of the meeting, which is the AABR AGM. Thank you very much.